We're very fortunate today to have three Master Gardeners with us for this presentation on growing herbs for beauty and flavor. The main presenters are Joan Cloutier and Pamela, and we also have Hilly Salo for to take some of your questions. Okay, so I am going to turn it over to Joan right now.
Okay, thank you. I'm Joan Cloutier. I'm going to present this today. We're going to talk a lot about herbs, and especially the culinary herbs. Okay, next slide. Oh, next slide. Oh, yeah. Okay, and we do recommend Zoom settings, microphone muted, video off, speaker view. Okay, next slide. Okay, we are Master Gardeners that are trained from the University of California. We're volunteers. The extension agents from the University of California spend so much time with the large growers in California. Agriculture is really big, so they really don't have time to deal with home gardeners. So they train us to do that. I want to mention we do have a helpline or hotline. We don't take walk-ins. The best way to reach us would be email. We also have a phone number, but email is the best. And on our website, mastergardeners.org, you'll get right to the Santa Clara Valley website, and you will see how to contact us. We have a little form for questions that you can ask, and we'll answer them. We do have some other things at Master Gardeners, monthly email and gardening tips and demonstration gardens, spring garden market, and some other things that you'll see on our website. Next slide. All right, this is an example. We probably won't get to all the questions you have today because there are always so many, but please, if you want to, you can contact us. This is on our website, how to contact us. On the right side, you'll see contact the help desk. And you can ask your question there if we don't get to it tonight or this afternoon. Okay, next slide. All right, first, I'm going to talk mainly about herbs today, but I want to make a differentiation about what an herb is and what is considered a spice. An herb is really grown for fresh leaves or soft plant parts, and sometimes they're dried, where spices are really ground up, crushed, or processed parts of seeds, bark, or root parts. Now, an example of a spice would be something like cumin, cinnamon, ginger, but cilantro is interesting because the foliage is considered an herb, but if you let it go to seed and dry the seeds, and they're often ground up, it's considered coriander, a spice. Next slide. Okay, why grow your own herbs? There are so many easy to grow herbs in our climate, and many can be picked all year round, whenever you want. You can save money growing herbs. Herbs usually are very inexpensive to grow, and they have low inputs, meaning less carbon footprint than buying them from the store. And with all the emphasis on single-use plastic packaging nowadays, most of the herbs in stores are sold in plastic packaging, so you can save a little bit of plastic that way. Okay, next slide. What to plant or what to grow? You have to think about, what are my favorite flavorings for food? What herbs do I like to use the most? Do you like Italian food or Thai food or whatever? So you can start thinking about the herbs that are used in those type of foods. Or you might want to grow herbs as ornamentals for your garden. You might want herbs that attract pollinators and beneficial insects. And there are annual, biennial, and perennial herbs. So for an annual herb, you have to think, am I willing to plant this every year? Because it's not going to last usually year to year. Next slide. Okay. All right, when to plant. This is kind of important, or very important. You want to plant at the right time of the year for that specific herb. And we're going to get into the specific herbs and some of their requirements later. Some herbs grow best in cool weather. Parsley and cilantro do fantastic in winter here in our climate, but others need warm temperature, like basil. When you have temperatures below 50 degrees at night, basil doesn't do so well anymore. So we'll talk about this in a few minutes, about the specific herbs. And next slide is where to plant. Okay, sun versus shade. I want to talk a little bit about this because sun, you know, the people who make plant tags for the growers who come out with their plant tags, or even people who write books or information about herbs, it's always difficult to figure out, should I say full sun or partial sun? It depends where you are sometimes, especially in a summer climate. You know, if you're, okay, full sun in Fresno, California is a lot different than full sun in San Francisco or Santa Cruz. So sometimes we'll say full sun for an herb, but if you're in one of those hot inland climates, you might do okay with part shade. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific herbs that don't do well in full sun in hot summer climates in a few minutes when we get to that. Water requirement is important. It's good to group your herbs by water requirement. Those, some of those tropical herbs require moisture all the time. Mediterranean herbs, usually you can, they have fairly drought tolerant, so you don't have to water them as much. So it's good to group your herbs by requirements. Okay, when to plant or where to, yeah, I think next slide, yeah. Okay, so sun versus shade. And we'll talk about some of the herbs, sun versus shade, if you're in a hot inland climate or you're close to the bay or whatever. Okay, and easy accessibility too, especially in winter. If you have to go through a muddy part of your yard to pick your herbs, you're probably not going to pick a lot of herbs. So think about that. Sometimes herbs in pots are really good, and containers. Next slide. Okay. Okay, weeds. It's always good to control weeds. They grow so fast and can get out of control in no time. Okay, so you want to control the weeds. They steal water and nutrients from your plants. They block light and they harbor bad pests and diseases. So please try to control your weeds. Next slide. Okay, pests and diseases. And there's a lot more information about some of these pests that we'll be getting in winter on our website. And I think Pam is going to post our UCIPM website or link on the chat room. She's going to be posting some real important links tonight. So you might want to look there. But snails and slugs, the rainy season is coming, but try not to do a lot of overhead watering where you're getting all the foliage wet. If you have to water, it's best to point the nozzle toward the root system of the herb, because the more you get the foliage wet, the more you're going to get snails and slugs and probably aphids too. Aphids look under the leaves because in cooler weather, they multiply really fast. You can usually wash them off with a heavy stream of water. They're not strong insects. When they fall off the plant, a lot of times ground beetles and other parasites and predators will get them. So try to wash them off, your first choice. Diseases are usually not a problem with herbs if you plant the right herb in the right place at the right time. Some of the herbs don't get really a lot of diseases. Okay, next slide. Okay, beneficial insects. I do want to mention that a lot of the flowering herbs are great at attracting beneficial insects that help control pests. Pests are not usually a real big problem on most herbs, but you might get some aphids during the winter and that. So on the bottom at the bottom of the slide, there's a beneficial wasp, and it's not one that bites you or anything, so don't worry, they're very small. They lay eggs inside aphids, and then the eggs hatch and they eat the inside of the aphid and come out, and you'll see these aphid mummies with holes in them. Okay, so it shows the adult laying eggs on the very bottom. Okay. And there are a lot of good beneficial insects that herbs attract when they're flowering. Cilantro is a great one when it's flowering. Dill is another one. Geez, oregano and thyme, and there's all kinds of good flowering herbs that you can get that attract beneficial insects. Next slide. Okay, a few things about maintaining herbs. Pruning or pinching the tips of most herbs encourages a lot more branching. And you want to eat the tender parts of the herb. Like that picture on the bottom with the hand in it, or the fingers, they're pinching off the top of a basil. And notice those leaves in there, right below the fingernails. Those leaves are going to grow bigger. And if you harvest them when they're young, they're going to be very tender and very good tasting. Old leaves on herbs taste the worst. Young leaves are usually the best. And sometimes pruning off the flowers, especially basil, of flowers of annual herbs will extend the productivity of the herb for a longer period of time. So pinching or pruning is a good idea on most herbs. Next slide. Oh, you know what? I forgot to mention one thing on the previous slide about maintaining herbs, but I can say it right now. Okay, nutrients. Most herbs don't need a lot of nutrients. You don't need high rates of fertilizer often, or you probably shouldn't fertilize herbs with high rates of fertilizer. Mainly, most of the herbs need nitrogen. So if you can get a fertilizer with higher nitrogen than anything else, that would be a good thing, because they mainly need nitrogen. A lot of herbs, when you plant them out in the yard in your native soil, they won't need very much fertilizer at all, or nutrients at all. But if you're in a container, potting soils don't contain very much fertilizer, and it doesn't last very long if it has any in. So you will have to, on a regular basis, probably use some fertilizer on potted plants, but you don't need big high rates. So look at the package and look at the rates on your fertilizer package and go toward the lower end of the rates. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about some easy to grow herbs in Northern California. Next slide. Okay, first there's annual, biennial, and perennial herbs. Annual herbs usually last a season or a year or less, and they're planted every year. It's something you probably should plant every single year. Biennial herbs last 2 years, but they're often treated as annuals because a lot of times the second year, they get kind of coarse and fibrous and they don't taste as good. Parsley would be an example of this. A lot of times the second year of parsley, it doesn't taste as good. It's not as tender. Perennial herbs, they last many years. Sometimes they last almost forever. Okay, next slide. Okay, first, now we're going to talk about some specific herbs. Okay. Okay, well, that's the slide. Okay, I'll say a few things. I'll say a few things about basil. It's a very tender annual. It can easily be started from seed, but it needs to be started in a warm environment. Boy, ideally, it's nice if you had your soil temperature close to 70, like 70 to 80 degrees. Basil germinates really fast. Like look at it, in 2 weeks, you could have basil looking like that. In 6 weeks, it's ready to harvest. But you need warm temperatures. Basil is native to Southeast Asia. It is a tropical plant. It's not a winter plant for Northern California. So just keep that in mind. So if you're starting from seed and if you're starting in spring, you still might want to start your seed indoors and then plant it outdoors when the weather gets warmer. Next slide. Okay, basil. It's very sensitive to frost and cold weather. And I want you to look at the 3 left pictures on the bottom of the screen because there's cold damage pictures. When night temperatures are below 50 degrees, basil starts getting cold damage, and it looks like the bottom pictures. Also, it's more prone to diseases like foliar diseases, like the third from the left picture there. You start getting leaf spots and all kinds of foliar diseases. It is a tropical plant. It does not like our winter temperatures. And usually we don't, Master Gardeners of Santa Clara County usually don't recommend planting basil before April sometimes. We usually say plant your basil about the time you plant your tomatoes, and that is not February. Even March can be too cold for basil. So April is probably right in the area. Okay, but the other thing I want to mention, in summer, if you're in one of those hot inland climates, your leaves might burn a little bit if you have high temperatures and full sun. Where I live in Inland Valley, close to Morgan Hill, we get really hot afternoon temperatures. And I do have some basil that's in the sun in summer, and some of my top leaves burn, but I prune it a lot. Sometimes I can find under leaves in the bushy part of the basil that are kind of shaded. Sometimes I find good leaves there. But I find that in my climate, the best place to grow basil is if they have some late afternoon shade. You know, but if you keep pruning your basil and you have some shady areas of your basil, you could use those leaves. Basil generally doesn't grow that well indoors. Now, if you have a real high light window, big windows and lots of light in winter, you might be able to grow it, but a lot of times it gets leggy or long branches, and it's not the easiest thing to grow indoors because of the light. It's possible, but it's not easy. So if you buy a basil plant in winter from the grocery store, it'll keep a few weeks indoors, but then it'll kind of start going downhill, unless, again, you have a really high light window with a lot of light. Next slide. Okay, on the next slide, I think I show, planting basil. It's good to add some compost when planting basil, or use a good potting soil if you're in a pot, but you want, remember, it's a tropical plant, so you want to keep it moist and mulch after planting. If you're in the soil, you want to fertilize lightly with nitrogen fertilizer with basil. It is a very leafy plant. It does like some nitrogen, but low rates. Next slide. There are lots, pinch tips and harvest leaves often, and there are lots of varieties of basil available. Just look at it, some of the pictures that I put on here. Crimson King, a red basil, and dwarf Greek basils, and Genovese and Thai and Napolitano, and then you've got cinnamon basil and lime basil and lemon basil, just all kinds of basils. And I would say there's lots of new varieties every single year, new varieties of basil. So there's a lot to pick from. It's kind of a fun crop to grow, but again, it's going to be more in summer, late spring and summer and early fall. Next. Now we'll talk a little, first, are there any questions I didn't get to about basil?
Someone asked about using lights inside.
Grow lights.
Yeah, grow lights.
Oh, Pam, you want to try answering that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Pam, I don't know if she's there, but.
Yeah, you can keep going. We can circle back to that one.
Okay, all righty. But yeah, you probably could use, if they're good grow lights. But okay, let's talk about cilantro. Okay, it's real easy to grow cilantro from seed, but it takes a little while to germinate, and it has a very hard seed coat. Now, if you soak your seeds for about a day or day and a half before planting, it'll germinate or sprout a lot quicker. So I really recommend soaking your seeds first with cilantro because of that hard seed coat. But once it germinates, it grows pretty fast. And for you people who grow cilantro in summer and say, oh, it just never looks that good. Cilantro in summer, it wants to bolt and flower real fast and put seeds on really, really fast. But in winter, cilantro grows really, really well. It can tolerate some severe frost too. It grows really well in winter, so it's a great winter herb. But if you do grow it in summer, afternoon shade might be better. Unless you're in a coastal climate, you probably could, grow cilantro in full sun. But part shade in summer would be better because, like I just said, it bolts or flowers real fast in hot weather, and you don't get as much foliage, which is usually what you use in cilantro. But cilantro, it is a great pollinator plant when flowering. It attracts all kinds of beneficial insects also. And one thing about cilantro, if you let it go to seed and dry the seeds, you can crush them and use it like coriander. It will become coriander, the spice. Next slide. Okay, dill. Now we'll talk about dill. Dill grows really easy from seed. It grows fairly tall and very fast, but it needs moist soil at the beginning when it's germinating and at the beginning. But after it flowers, it can tolerate some drought once it flowers. It can survive in drier soil after it flowers and still produce some seeds. So in dill, some people use the foliage, some people use flowers for culinary purposes, and some people just use the seeds. So it's a nice herb. It can't tolerate real heavy frost. Light frost is okay. If you're close to the bay or the coast, you probably could grow dill in winter, although it doesn't like really cold weather. The flowers attract beneficial insects. It's one of our great plants for beneficial insects if you let it flower. You can eat the leaves, flowers, and seeds. And dill it's a really nice, fragrant, kind of pretty plant to have in the garden. Next slide. I had to put this in. Nasturtiums are so beautiful, and it's a great herb. It's usually considered an annual plant, easily grown from seed. Some people would just consider it a flower, but in a lot of the herb books, they'll say nasturtium is a good herb. When you start it, it needs moist soil, but it can tolerate some drought once it gets well established. It will grow in full sun if you're in a cool climate, like near the bay or near the coast. But if you are in one of those real hot inland climates, you might want part shade because the leaves and the flowers burn real easily if you're getting afternoons in the 95-degree or 90-degree temperature range. The leaves and flowers, the flowers are great in salads. They add a lot of color to a salad, and flowers and leaves have a peppery taste. They're great for salad. And the hummingbirds and pollinators love nasturtiums. If you have nasturtiums in your yard, you'll probably have some hummingbirds there. Let's see, what else about nasturtiums? Oh, if you're near the coast, you may be able to grow these in winter. They may overwinter. I have seen nasturtiums near the coast that kind of last all year. They're almost like perennials near the coast if you don't have any frost. And you can get trailing nasturtiums and mounding nasturtiums too in different colors. They're really nice. Next slide. One thing I just remembered about nasturtiums that I forgot to tell you, the seed pods and buds can be pickled. And if you do this, they'll taste sort of like capers. So it would be a caper substitute. Okay, but anyway, getting on to parsley. Parsley is really a biennial plant. It will last 2 years, but it's grown as an annual because, like I said, sometimes the second year, it gets kind of fibrous. The leaves get kind of fibrous. Now, if you do grow it for the second year, sometimes if you just pick the new growth in the middle of the parsley plant, it's not so bad, but it's in the carrot family. It will put a taproot, and it will start to get, the older leaves will get very, very fibrous. Parsley likes some moist soil. It's a good idea to add compost when planting and some organic mulch around the plant. When I say mulch, there are a lot of things you can use for mulch. You could use straw. You could use tree trimmings. A lot of times there's old leaves in there and maybe some wood chips and that. That's fine too. You know, things like that, bark, it's fine around the plant because if you're growing parsley in summer, it likes a cool, moist soil. So mulch really helps keep that cool, moist soil. In winter, parsley, by the way, grows really well in winter, and it can survive severe frost. So again, parsley is a fantastic winter plant. You can grow parsley in part shade, especially if you're in a hot summer climate. Parsley leaves will burn if you get those 90-degree temperatures in the all afternoon in a hot inland climate. So during in the coast areas, you may not see this, but in the inland hot summer climates, you may get burned. So sometimes it might be good to plant parsley where you get some afternoon shade if you're growing it in summer. In winter, it doesn't matter though. In winter, you can grow it in full sun all over California. Okay, let's see, anything on, oh, parsley, you might want to use a fertilizer, again, that contains more nitrogen than anything else, and feed it once in a while because it is a leafy, fast-growing plant. So look at your fertilizer package. If you can get, fertilizer has 3 numbers on the package. The first number is nitrogen. If you can get a fertilizer with more nitrogen than anything else, that would be good for most of these herbs that we're talking about tonight. But just use low rates. You don't have to use high rates. Okay, next slide. Oh, bay laurel. Okay, this is kind of different because it's really, it can be a tree or very tall shrub and it's evergreen. Bay laurel is native to the Mediterranean region. I was reading at one time the Mediterranean from Spain to Greece, there were bay laurel, big forests all over before deforestation occurred and the population expanded. But this Mediterranean plant does very well in the Bay Area. The leaves are used for flavoring a lot of different foods. And also, you can grow it in full sun or part shade. It does very well in a container for a long period of time. So sometimes during Christmas, you'll see Christmas trees that are in like that black pot on the bottom right. They're pruned like Christmas trees. The bay laurel is pruned like Christmas trees. And once established, it's very drought tolerant. So again, it tolerates heavy pruning. So some nurseries will make bay laurel into a tree, and some will prune it like a tall hedge, a tall shrub, but it can tolerate heavy pruning. So that's good to know if you need a tall hedge somewhere and you also want an herb. So anyway, okay, next slide. Okay, chives. Chives are a perennial herb. You can grow it in full sun or partial shade. In full sun in real hot climates, you may have a little bit of burn, but usually chives can tolerate it. Very little care is needed for chives, but you probably want to keep the chives fairly moist. Use some compost when planting, and keep the flowers picked too. When it starts flowering, it's good to cut off all the flowers and maybe cut the whole plant down to maybe 2 inches. But the flowers are edible, but they're kind of fibrous. So anyway, keep that in mind. You can start harvesting your chives a month after your plant is growing. The best time to eat chives is when the leaves are kind of small and tender, not when they're real tough. You don't have to harvest all the foliage at once with chives if you don't want to. Chives mainly need some nitrogen, so fertilizer with more nitrogen than anything else would be good. And you don't have to fertilize very often. Very light rates, very infrequent. Unless you're in a container, then more regular fertilizer. Okay, chives, let's see. You can start them from seed or you can divide existing plants. Dividing existing plants is really easy. It's a quick way to get chives if you have a friend who has some chives plants. Okay, next slide. Okay, were there some questions that Hilly that you want to bring up, or?
It looks like Pamela's getting to all the questions.
Wow, okay, great. Very good. Okay, lavender. Wow, this is one of my favorites. I just love lavender and there's so many varieties to pick from. Lavender is sometimes, it's a Mediterranean plant. It's funny, the classification for lavender, it's all over the board. And also the genus species classification is kind of all over the board. But I'll talk about some of the best species for culinary purposes. But first, lavender, you may find it in books as a woody perennial. It's usually classified as a subshrub, and sometimes as an herb, sometimes as an ornamental shrub, sometimes as a perennial flower, So it's kind of all over the board, but it can be used as an herb if you use the right varieties. The best varieties for culinary purposes have a sweet, strong floral flavor, and the English lavenders are the top picks for culinary use. Lavandula angustifolia would be the genus species, but there are English lavender hybrids that are also very good now for cooking. Lavandula, latifolia, and intermedia. And some of the French lavender varieties are also good for culinary purposes, like Provence. And lavender, there are so many plant breeders working on lavender with new varieties, with different flowers or more flowers. And there's so much to pick from, and there's so many good lavender plants available now. And this plant grows very well in our area, very, very well. Next slide. What I want to caution you about, the one to avoid for culinary purposes is Spanish lavender. Spanish lavender, lavenders have something called camphor oil in them, but the camphor oil in Spanish lavender is too high and too strong. It does not taste good, way too strong. So you probably don't want to pick this one, but there are a lot of nice Spanish lavenders for your landscape. So if you don't care about cooking with lavender or adding it to your food, you can use Spanish lavender for a beautiful ornamental in your yard or in a pot. But one thing about all lavenders, they pretty much all need very good drainage. They're, again, Mediterranean plants used to dry summers and rainy winters. So no soggy soil, especially in summer. If you water your lavender plant and get soggy soil in summer, you will probably get root rot and it will probably die. Now, if you're planting lavender in a container, it might be best to use a real porous mix, something that drains really fast. Sometimes mixes with a lot of perlite, lava rock, cinder in the soil would be good. If you're planting it in the soil in your yard, you may want to put it on a slight mound so it doesn't get soggy, especially when you're in clay soil. So it's fairly drought tolerant. Once established, you don't have to water established lavender very much. It will grow in clay soil if you don't get it soggy, especially in summer. That's the worst part. So again, it needs a fast draining soil, no matter where you are in a container or in the yard. Next slide. Okay, I want to mention a few things about pruning lavender. Okay, because this is a little bit tricky. You want to lightly prune new growth in spring, but also after flowering, you can prune lavender after it's done flowering. But the main thing, only remove maybe a third or less of the leaf tips. Always leave some green branches there. Don't cut it all the way down to the woody base. And I love this diagram on the left because it shows what not to cut lavender down to. You may lose the plant if you prune it too much. So again, just take the tips off, maybe a third of the branches or so. Now the plant on the right, you can see it probably wasn't pruned very much, but that circle there, that's where you don't want to prune it down to that level. If you want to try to rejuvenate this plant, just prune the tips, maybe a third of the way down or so. Let's see. Another thing I forgot to say on the other slide about lavender. Okay, lavender, once you put it in your yard, it hardly ever requires fertilizer. Once it's in your yard, if you're in a pot, maybe in a container, occasional light fertilization would be good because again, potting soil isn't going to contain many nutrients and they won't last very long anyway. But in the soil, very, very little and very infrequent fertilizer. Okay, next, now we can go to the next slide, lavender harvesting. Now you might want to think, okay, I want to use lavender for tea or for lemonade or something like that. You want to harvest the flowers before they turn brown. It's better to harvest lavender flowers when they're younger than too old, okay? Young flowers, and even if they're in buds, by the way, lavender will still flower if you pick lavender that has mainly buds on it. They will open and flower, but older is not so good. So pick lavender when it's young, whether you use it, in your cooking or culinary purposes, or if you're picking it for flowers on your table or something. And also leaves, young leaves, of course, young tender leaves are better than old leaves. And there's lots of recipes for lavender. If you Google lavender recipes or recipes containing lavender, next slide, you'll just get so many varieties of recipes, from desserts to meat dishes and lemonade and drinks and pastas and everything. Lavender, it's amazing. When you start I experimented with this a little bit and I was amazed, like lavender chicken, and there are things that taste really good. Lavender is a great herb to use in a lot of different foods. So have fun with lavender. There's a lot available, and lavender is becoming so popular and it grows so well in our Mediterranean climate. All right, next slide. Now we're going to something totally different than lavender. Okay.
We do have some pretty good lavender questions.
Okay.
I'm going to answer a couple. There's been a couple, growing lavender from seed versus cuttings.
Oh, yeah.
Because people do like to share. And sort of when should you expect to cut back your lavender to keep it from becoming sort of too woody and too big to harvest from?
Okay. Do you want to answer that, or should I answer that?
Go ahead.
Okay. Cutting lavender back, I think on the slide, the previous to this one about lavender prune, or one slide back. Yeah, lavender pruning. I think if you consistently, maybe twice a year, at least once or twice a year, do some pruning on your lavender, you'll probably be okay to avoid it getting too woody. If you cut the tips off, like the slide on the left, or like the picture on the left, you should be okay. And again, you can do this on new growth in spring, and then again after it flowers. Cut it back after it flowers. If you remove a little more than a third, that's okay, as long as you don't start taking off that woody base. That's the main thing. And then the other question was about lavender. Cuttings versus seed. Lavender is hard to start from seed. It takes forever to germinate. It takes really long, and it can't dry out. It's really difficult. So cuttings are the best way. Yes, you can propagate them from cuttings, and I don't have time to talk about propagation, but you may, the other thing, Pam, I think Pam was going to post some links about lavender that UCANR, Pam Geisel, wrote some really good little papers on lavender, on Homeowner's Guide to Lavender or something. And they're really nice little guides about growing lavender. It doesn't talk a lot about propagation, but there's a lot on the web about propagating lavender. So I can't get into that, but it is pretty easy to propagate lavender.
And there was one last question. If growing lavender more for scent than culinary uses, I know, you mentioned the camphor and Spanish lavender. For scent versus actual cooking, do you have a recommendation for a type?
I think a lot of the French lavenders are used a lot for scent, and the English lavender could use for scent. The Spanish lavender does have kind of an annoying scent. Now that's my opinion, but I grow all of them. I have a lot of them in my yard, and the Spanish is when you squish a leaf or a flower and smell it, the Spanish is kind of annoying. So I would say for scent, stay away from the Spanish lavender.
Yeah, I feel like it smells more like sage than it does lavender itself. I've had some success with some trimmings from Lavender Grosso as well, also smelling pretty good.
Oh, okay, good.
Also, someone asked about which lavender variety might be better for containers.
You know what? There's a whole bunch of petite lavenders. You know what? I might have put one in my slide. Okay, you know what? The best thing to go to your garden center, and they're selling a lot of real petite lavenders now. And there are so many varieties, and there's so many new, every single month. I get this publication called Greenhouse Grower, because I used to work in horticulture. And you wouldn't believe how many new varieties, and a lot of them are oriented toward containers. Because let's face it, most of the new houses don't have big yards, and there's a lot of container gardening going on. So there's lots of new varieties, but I think in your garden center, if you go to a good garden center, you may discover some right there at your garden center. Or you might, there are just a lot of varieties available right now. Okay, anything else?
No, I think we're good.
One more thing, they said, how long would a lavender plant last?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, because I used to deal with this one grower who was really an herb expert. He was a big grower and grew a lot of herbs for the garden centers. And he felt that, but this is only his opinion, but he had a lot of experience. He felt lavender probably has a lifespan, at the best case, maybe 14 to 16 years, but a lot of them probably won't last that long. But it depends on the culture and the care you give it to. If it's in a good draining environment, you know, that you're not getting soggy soil and all that. But he said most lavenders, they're not going to last over 14 or 16 years, most of them. Okay, and they may last less, so, you know, don't get mad if it lasts less. But they should last, you know, a good 5 or 10 years for sure. Okay, I guess we can go on, unless there's something else urgent. Okay, we'll go on to lemongrass. Okay, lemongrass. Now this is a tropical plant, native to Southeast Asia. The seed takes a really long time to start, and I've done this, and it takes forever to grow. The plant in the middle of the middle picture, that's when that's a lemongrass I started from seed, but now it's huge. Okay, it's a perennial in most of the Bay Area. I want to warn you, this plant, lemongrass, can get huge. It really likes kind of a tropical environment, but it will overwinter in our climate. And the closer you are to the bay, the better it'll last through the winter. Where I get severe frost where I live, but it dies down, but it comes back every year. So even if you're in a frosty environment, lemongrass in our climate will usually last as a perennial, last year to year. It likes full sun to part shade. Moist soil with compost is a good idea and good to mulch around the plant. It likes nitrogen fertilizer. Every cat I've ever owned loves lemongrass and seems to be attracted to it for some reason, but it will get to be a really big plant. It's easy to divide existing plants and propagate it from divisions. Like, see the picture on the top right-hand side? You probably could stick those in soil and they probably will sprout some roots and you can get a plant. That's how we have propagated them when we were growing herbs for spring garden market. Okay, so it's used as flavoring. Lemongrass is great for flavoring all kinds of foods, Asian foods and tea and drinks. It has a real pleasant lemony flavor. Even when I make lemonade, I like to put some lemongrass water in it because it has a pleasant flavor. Okay, next slide. Lovage. Now this is a totally different plant. It came from Northern Europe and it's in the carrot family. It likes rich, moist soil. It's a good idea to use compost and mulch when you plant it. This would be a hard one to grow in a pot. You could in a real big pot, but it gets huge. Lovage will get to be a huge plant. It's partial, it will take partial or almost full shade. If you're in a hot climate, it can pretty well grow in full shade. The flavor is very celery-like, but a little stronger and sweeter. So it kind of likes cool climate. The flowers, leaves, roots, stem, and seeds are all edible. And if you look at the picture on the top right-hand side, I think that's a Bloody Mary, and they used the stem as a straw. The stems of lovage are hollow inside, so they make really good straws. You can start lovage from seeds. Also, sometimes you can divide existing plants. The seeds take a while to germinate, but they're pretty easy to germinate. But most people just buy a plant. It can grow, pretty fast, but it does become a huge plant. And I'm talking like 3 to 5 feet tall and several feet wide. Okay, and anyway, okay. I think that's all about lovage. Yeah, the flowers are great. They attract beneficial insects. Okay, mint. I think a lot of you are familiar with mint. There's lots of different varieties. And if you look at the pictures, you have spearmint and peppermint and pineapple mint, apple mint, lemon mint, cinnamon mint, all kinds of different types of mints, pineapple mint. So they're all over the board. There's lots of different mint flavors. But this is real easy to grow in a pot. You can neglect, if you think you're a really bad gardener and nothing survives, try growing mint in a pot, because usually it'll survive. It spreads really rapidly with rhizomes or underground roots. So you probably shouldn't plant it in your yard, because in a few years it'll be everywhere. And it's really hard to contain once it gets started in your yard. So it's really best to keep it in a container because it's so invasive. And it doesn't require a lot of care. It does like some fertilizer once in a while, especially if you're in a container anyway. And again, nitrogen fertilizer more than anything else. You can grow it in full sun or shade. It doesn't have a lot of picky requirements. Very easy to grow. Easy to propagate from cuttings. Very easy. Or rhizomes, underground stems. Just pull out some existing plants and you can start them, existing rhizomes. Okay, next. Okay, oregano. Oregano is one of those Mediterranean plants. It can tolerate sun or part shade. When you're planting oregano at the beginning, keep it moist initially, but once it's established, it can tolerate a lot of drought. But it does need some pruning, especially after flowering. Now, there are a lot of different types of oregano. The Greek oregano is stronger. Marjoram, by the way, is really an oregano, but it's a little bit milder in flavor than Greek oregano. Italian oregano is a little milder. And then you have all these like golden oregano and variegated oregano. So there's a big choice there. A few things I want to say. Golden oregano, it's a beautiful mounding oregano plant. But it doesn't tolerate hot, sunny, blazing hot climates in summer. It will burn. If you're in one of those inland hot summer climates, you might want to grow it in shade, because golden oregano will burn if it has those long, hot afternoon sunny climates. Okay, what else about oregano? It spreads horizontally. It becomes somewhat mounding if you prune it all the time. It's good to prune, especially the Greek oregano. It gets big flower stalks, like on the right, it's flowering. After that, it's good to prune it down. It's very easy to propagate. You just pull out some existing branches and they will root very, very easily. It's a very tough plant once it becomes established. It can take abuse, kind of like mint. It can take a lot of abuse, oregano can. Okay, I think we're done with that. Next slide. Okay, rosemary. Rosemary can tolerate full sun. It can tolerate hot afternoon blazing sunlight, and it does just fine. You need good drainage for rosemary. It's one of those Mediterranean herbs that if you give it too much water in summer and you have soggy soil, you will kill it. It will get root rot and die quickly. So it has excellent drought tolerance. It's also a great pollinator plant. When rosemary blooms, you will have bees galore all over the place. It's best to get a plant or take cuttings. You can propagate it very easily by cuttings, but seeds take a long time if you're trying to propagate rosemary. It's easy to propagate by cuttings. Sometimes I just take cuttings and like this time of the year, I stick it in some soil outside, and by next spring, I have roots on them. So very easy to propagate rosemary. Let's see, next slide. Okay, there are a lot of varieties of rosemary. I'll make a few comments about the best culinary varieties are usually the upright varieties. And actually, I think for landscape purposes, if you want a tall hedge, some of those upright varieties make really nice evergreen tall hedges, like Tuscan Blue, Blue Spires, Spice Island, and there are some others. But if you're buying a rosemary at the garden center, you might want to look in the herb section, because in the landscape section, sometimes they have those shorter varieties that are kind of curly branches and stuff like that. And they're not, you can eat them, you can use them as spices or as herbs and food. But the best ones, the chefs feel the best ones are, they always have their favorite varieties. And I know Spice Island was a real popular variety when it first came out with chefs, because they felt it had the best flavor for culinary purposes, and Tuscan Blue and Blue Spires. So look in the herb section of the garden center, not the landscape section if you're going to buy a rosemary plant for culinary purposes. Rosemary tolerates pruning really well. At Christmas time, you'll see a lot of Christmas trees, live Christmas trees that are really rosemary that were pruned into Christmas trees. And it's a great landscape ornamental plant. And I'll say these upright varieties that are good for culinary purposes, they look great as landscape plants too. I have one, the plant in the middle slide is mine in my garden. I let it get my height, about 5 feet or 5 feet 4 inches. I keep it pruned to that height and it makes a nice hedge. And I keep it pruned every year and it's lasting many, many, many years. Let's see, what else about rosemary? Okay, yeah, it is a good idea to prune your rosemary because they do develop real long branches that may bend over time. Now, if they bend over and touch the soil and you have soil over the branches, you may get some new plants. The branches might start rooting where you're actually going to be propagating some new plants. Okay, next slide. Next, we're going to talk about sage. Okay, there's lots of different sages available, but the ones for culinary purposes, again, are usually sold in the herb section of the garden center. And the best species for culinary purposes is Salvia officinalis. Okay, Salvia officinalis. And there's lots of varieties of this species, lots of varieties. And the next slide will show that, but we won't get to that yet. Sage needs really good drainage, just like your other Mediterranean plants, especially in summertime. In summer, if you have soggy soil, sage and soggy soil, you will kill the plant. It requires full sun. It can take hot blazing sun, no problem. Very drought tolerant once established. Before it's established, though, keep it kind of moist, but once established, it's pretty drought tolerant. Sage is a wonderful plant that attracts pollinators and lots of hummingbirds. Hummingbirds love sage when it flowers. It could be short-lived. Now, the Salvia officinalis, some literature will tell you it might last 3 to 5 years. Some might say 5 to 7 years. I've had Salvia officinalis that lasted 3 years and died for no reason at all, and some that's going on 10 years that looks perfectly healthy. So it may not be a real long-lived perennial, but it'll live a few years at least or longer. Okay, next slide. Okay, this just shows some varieties or cultivars of Salvia officinalis, the one we use for an herb. You can get beautiful variegated sages that are kind of yellowish or purplish or purple, and they are a wonderful in pots or in your garden, a wonderful ornamental plant. It is a good idea to prune them once in a while, usually after flowering, because they're going to have real long branches otherwise that droop down. They can tolerate really, really hot sun, a lot of heat they can tolerate. It's a great plant to plant in your area with lavender, thyme, rosemary, and culinary sage. It's just a fantastic ornamental plant in addition to being an herb. Okay, next slide. Okay, Stevia. Now this is something totally different. It's a subtropical plant. This plant actually evolved in, they think it's Paraguay or Uruguay, somewhere around there in South America, actually. It was used to sweeten cocoa by the native people originally in South America. It's best when you're growing it to keep the soil moist, especially while it's becoming established, and use compost and mulch around the plant if you're growing it in the soil. If you're growing it in a pot, give it a good potting soil, and you should occasionally fertilize it, but not with high rates. It's a tender perennial. It will die down to the ground if you have if you're in a frosty climate, like maybe in the Morgan Hill Gilroy area, but it also may burn in hot afternoon sun. If you're in an inland climate, sometimes it's best in afternoon shade in summer, especially. One of the things I should say about dying down to the ground, if you get frost, it usually will come back the next year. I'm even surprised in my frosty climate, I get real heavy frost in winter, and it still comes back. I didn't think it would, but it comes back the next year. Okay, it contains a compound called stevioside, and it contributes to the sweetness of the leaves. It's best to use the leaves. When it flowers, the plant gets more bitter. Like it's flowering right now, or it's pretty much done for the year. But stevia tastes best in the early, like spring and early summer, but late summer when it starts flowering, you will notice it gets a little more bitter. It doesn't taste as good, but in early summer, it's fantastic. You can, some people, they just boil some leaves and use the liquid to sweeten things like drinks and things like that. The plants can get fairly large. I have the one in the middle is now is my plant that I planted from a seed, but actually stevia is easier to propagate from cuttings. You can be growing, seed or cuttings. Seeds take a long time though. But the middle plant, I want to say now it's in a 7-gallon container, and it keeps coming. I have it outside, it keeps coming back every year. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant. Okay, next slide. Okay, French tarragon. It's a tender perennial. It might die down to the ground in winter though, but it will come back in spring. It's usually propagated by root divisions or cuttings, but but tarragon is kind of weird because the seeds are usually sterile, so you usually can't propagate it by seeds. A light frost is maybe okay for tarragon. A heavy frost will probably kill it, but it might come back the next year in spring. So it's more of a Mediterranean summer plant. It needs very good drainage. You can kill French tarragon if you give it too much summer water and it gets soggy. You will kill it. Tarragon can survive in full sun or partial shade, and it's good to start it in moist soil. You can let it dry out a little bit between watering, and it needs regular pruning to keep it like more bushy so it doesn't get so long and everything. Okay, next slide. Okay, thyme. Thyme is a real popular Mediterranean herb. It's really interesting when you read about thyme, how it was used in the ancient times. It was used sometimes for embalming bodies and stuff like that. I don't know, in ancient times. And then in the medieval times, it was used as an antiseptic. It's also used in Listerine mouthwash. So thymal, it's called thymal oil in thyme. It's a strong antiseptic. But anyway, just some interesting side facts about thyme. There's a lot of different varieties of thyme. Some are used more as ornamentals. There's one that's called woolly thyme that grows really close to the soil, and you can actually walk on it. And it has really tiny leaves, but it's not a good culinary thyme, but it's interesting, all the varieties of thyme there are. But the ones for culinary use are usually Thymus vulgaris, and that's the garden thyme or French thyme or English thyme, or Thymus citriodorus, and that's lemon thyme, lime thyme, and there are some others. So there's a lot of different varieties you can get that will work for culinary purposes. It works very well with other Mediterranean plants. I think we have another slide here. Next slide. Okay, yeah, thyme can grow in full sun or part shade. It's pretty drought tolerant once established, but again, it needs good drainage. You don't want summer soggy soil, and it does produce some real long branches. So it is good to prune it occasionally. Let's see, the flowers attract pollinators and a lot of beneficial insects. You can use the leaves and the flowers in cooking. Occasional pruning is really a good idea. Every few years, if the stems become really woody, you may want to try to either rejuvenate the plant or get a new plant. But sometimes you can rejuvenate the plant by broadcasting some fine soil or fine mulch all over the top of your thyme plant, because what may happen is some of those branches might sprout roots, and you will be kind of artificially propagating some new branches there. And that's actually how you would propagate thyme too. You could cut off branches and take cuttings and propagate it that way. Thyme could be grown from seed too, but it's pretty easy to propagate from cuttings. Okay, what else? Thyme is a perennial. It's a perennial plant. It should last quite a few years. Okay, and I think that's about it for thyme. There are a lot of different thymes. Okay, a few things about herb gardens. It's good to group your plants by their cultural requirements. Like put all your Mediterranean and drought tolerant plants in one area. Like you wouldn't want to put something like Stevia, which requires a more moist soil, or basil in with all your Mediterranean plants if you're not going to water very much. So here are some examples of some drought tolerant Mediterranean herbs. You know, the lavenders, the rosemaries, sage, thyme, they go very well with each other. Bay laurel. I see in the picture on the left bottom, there's like a bay laurel shrub kind of on the top of that picture. And then the border has all kinds of thyme that's blooming. Of course, they took the picture when everything's blooming too. And you won't have that all year round, but herbs are beautiful. Next slide. Okay, here's some other examples. Oops. I think the slide before that was another dry garden. Yeah, and then here's a lot of rosemary in some of these pictures, and sages, and so you can see in some other examples of just some gardens here, dry gardens. And then the next slide will show shade, like some of the things that grow well in shade. We're talking about parsley and chives and nasturtiums and things like that. So if you have a shady area, you can still have an herb garden. You can still grow these and they'll grow very well. Okay, and next slide. And containers. Don't forget about containers. You can grow, most herbs grow very, very well in containers. And I think on the top left is kind of a dry containers and terracotta pots. And then you have all kinds of different containers with different herbs. So if that's all you have is a patio, you can still grow herbs. You should still be able to grow herbs in containers. So, okay. And I think, okay, I hope you enjoy using your herbs, and we'll take questions now. But herbs, you know, again, they can be used for so many different types of foods. So it's well worth it to grow herbs. And you can make a certain food like a pasta taste totally different depending what herbs you use, or chicken or something like that. Tastes totally different. So anyway, okay. So I hope that gave you a little bit of information. And now we'll save some time for questions here.
Yeah, Joan. Let's start with one herb you didn't talk about yet. Savory.
Oh, summer savory.
And there's a winter too, right? It's not.
I think it's mainly summer savory.
Okay.
No, I didn't talk about that at all.
It's not very common. It's delicious.
It's probably not. It's not. But it's best to grow it in summer. And it's a little bit drought. It's somewhat drought tolerant, but summer would be the time to grow it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is almost worthy of a presentation itself in this area. There are so many questions that come to Master Gardeners about this, but curry leaf.
Oh, okay. Yeah, curry leaf
has more in common with a tree, I know, but.
Yeah, right. And I didn't have that. I wasn't going to talk about that. It really requires a warm climate. I know if you're going to grow it, it needs a real warm climate. It's a tropical plant. So you need a warm climate. It does not tolerate frost or cold night temperatures. So it does better, I think, in summer. If you're close to the bay, I think you can grow it. I know people that do grow it here, but it doesn't like cold weather.
I have one that's not dead, but
Okay.
that's about all I got to say for it. I definitely think that would be great for a future. I mean, for those who are interested and want to know more, I think that is really actually a great topic for a future article or something for Master Gardeners. So
Yeah, it would be.
I think that's something that we'll try to bring up.
Yeah, and it's hard to talk about all the herbs in one talk because, I mean, you could just talk about lavender and give a whole talk on lavender or thyme or sages or something like that. So anyway, okay.
Besides fresh culinary use, of course, some of these things are only great in the summer and, winter. They're about now, they're sort of going kaput for the season. Do you want to talk at all about, drying for culinary purposes and using in the off season?
Okay, I'll admit right now, I'm not an expert at that. But yeah, I know some of the things that really dry well are thyme. Okay, the ones that I do know really well, oregano and thyme are really easy to dry. Very easy if you have a dehydrator or an oven on very, very low, because you can burn things really fast. So put it on low and you can experiment with that. I think sage can be dried, but I'm not an expert at some of the other things because I mainly use fresh, fresh herbs. I don't know, maybe somebody here is more of an expert at drying, but I know thyme and oregano are really good herbs to dry.
Yeah, I've had great success with all kinds of thyme. One of my favorite things to do is actually been taking all like 5 or 6 types of thyme I have in my garden and dry them together and put them together as a blend. And you kind of get like the best of, both of all the worlds of all the flavors, especially when you're doing something like a winter soup or something when you really want thyme to be a real dominant flavor at that point. And something that may be of interest to people as well is that besides you can freeze sage as well because there's sort of enough oil in the leaf, although I'm not that thrilled with the flavor, but one thing that some people do is actually pre-fry the sage in ghee and then stick that in the freezer.
Oh, wow.
So, as long as you're starting a soup or something where, you want that as a base, that's a great way to get that flavor in. But my sage is 7 years old. So okay. I just go out and harvest only what I need in the winter.
I do that too. But basil is one thing because basil doesn't grow well in the winter here. No. And I know a lot of people who freeze basil in ice cube containers, yes. Or they make pesto sauce and then they freeze it in ice cube containers in the winter.
Yes, I think I like the result of doing sort of the pesto. I skip the nuts, but do that kind of thing in oil and then freeze that. I think it tends to get the fresh flavor off a little better. But I will also admit to going and buying a plant, as this was brought up at the beginning, going and buying a plant from Trader Joe's that was grown in a greenhouse if I want a whole lot of fresh basil in January and just harvest the whole plant.
Yeah, and the plant will probably last a few weeks, but you're not gonna grow it through the whole season, probably. But that's kind of the purpose of those Trader Joe basil plants. people keep it in the kitchen and they harvest it as they use it for maybe a couple of weeks, and then it goes kind of doesn't do well anymore.
Exactly. There's another question about chamomile.
Oh, chamomile. Yeah, I was kind of debating about that one. Chamomile, be careful. It can be very invasive. We grew it at the demo garden in Gilroy, and everyone was sorry we did it because it reseeds so fast. So if you grow chamomile, it is easy to grow. It's easy to germinate from seed. And the flowers look kind of like daisies almost. But wow, if you let it seed in your yard, it comes up everywhere the next year. So be kind of careful about it. They don't want it at the demo garden anymore because of our experience there.
Well, and I'll say I have the same sort of caution. I love cilantro with all of my heart. And I find that the cilantro that comes up from the seeds that dropped, that come up, say, January, February, and that flowers in April, it's just the perfect time to bring the beneficials to my garden, right when I'm sticking all my, wanted plants in there. But when it comes up, it is got one sturdy root and you will be shoveling it out. So if you want it only in a small area, knock your dried plant over into a paper bag or something and collect your seeds. Don't let them fall off the plant everywhere. You may regret it.
Yes, yeah. Okay, well, I don't know.
Any other questions? I think we pretty much covered what was in the Zoom, yeah.
Okay. I think I did see a question about fertilizer going bad, and I worked a lot with fertilizers in my life, in my previous life when I was working. And your dry fertilizers, they won't go bad as long as they're kept dry in a dry location. You don't get them wet. If they get wet, they might start sticking together. There'll still be nutrients there. They'll still, I should say, they still have nutrients, but it'll be harder to use them because they might clump together or so. And your soluble nutrients too should last a long time. But if you get them wet, they start clogging and it's harder to use them.
Yes. Oh, one other thing that came up in discussing the timing on cilantro, besides all of winter, if you really do want cilantro all summer long, you need to keep starting new plants because when the bolting is determined by the temperature, you cannot get around that. You have to just keep starting new plants.
You are absolutely right. Yeah. Sometimes what I do, I scatter some seeds in an area that I know I'm going to water, but maybe I pulled out another crop or something. So I started, and then I keep doing that all summer long in an area that might be a little bit vacant. I start some more cilantro because, it flowers so fast and goes to seed so fast in summer. But boy, in winter, is it ever good in winter? Wow. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Joan and Pamela, Hilly. We will have this recording up in a couple of weeks, and I will email everybody when it's posted to our YouTube channel. I will try to save the chat and let you know about that as well. I'm inspired to go out and plant some cilantro right now.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for everybody for coming. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.